The valley held its breath under a sky the color of old iron. Torches cut the dark, riders coming hard up the frozen track toward a single cabin light. A door slammed open. She stood in the frame 7 feet of stillness, an iron poker hanging loose in one scarred hand. Behind her, a wounded man fought to rise, leg useless, blood still dark on the floorboards. Horses shied. One rider's hand drifted toward his belt. The man in the fine coat smiled the way a wolf smiles when it already tastes the kill. She stepped down into the snow without a word. The nearest horse reared as she closed the distance. The sky had the color of an old bruise. Snow not falling yet. Just waiting. Waiting the way the whole town seemed to be waiting. For what? Nobody said out loud. 5 women had already stood on that platform, 5 names called, 5 prices paid. The auctioneer's voice had gone hoarse from shouting numbers into a crowd that only wanted a bargain. Freya Lindqvist stood at the end of the line. Last, always last. Her coat was too thin for a Montana winter. Her boots were cracked at the toe, but she did not shiver. She would not give this town that, because shivering was a kind of surrender. And Freya Lindqvist did not surrender. Not to cold, not to hunger, not to men who looked at her like she was a mistake God forgot to correct. She was 26 years old, 7 feet of her, standing straight in a square that had never built a doorway tall enough. Shoulders like a blacksmith's, because she was a blacksmith's daughter, and her hands told the truth her mouth never bothered to. Calluses over calluses. A burn scar along the left wrist, pale and old, shaped like nothing, shaped like everything her father had ever taught her. He was dead now. 8 months dead, a debt he never should have owed, called in by men who smiled while they ruined him. And when the smiling men were done with the father, they came for the daughter, not a wife sale. Nobody was pretending that. This was Ashford Creek's own quiet cruelty, a custom the town had built for itself somewhere in the hungry years after the war, when men with land and no labor found women with debt and no protection, and decided the two problems solved each other. They called it a settlement. Everyone else called it what it was and said nothing. The auctioneer looked at Freya the way a man looks at a horse he suspects will kick him. Next lot, he said. Miss Lindqvist, strong back, willing hands. A pause and something ugly crept into his voice. Unusual size. Laughter. Not loud. Worse than loud. The kind of laughter that didn't even bother to hide itself, because why would it? Because who was going to stop it? Someone in the back called out a word Freya had heard in 3 languages now, crossing an ocean and half a continent to hear it in English too. She did not flinch. She had trained her face the way her father trained steel. Heat it. Hold it. Let nothing show until it was ready. $80, the auctioneer tried. Silence, 70. Nothing, 50. Come now, gentlemen, she'll outwork 2 men and eat what 1 does. A man near the front snorted, she'll eat what 3 do. More laughter. Freya's jaw tightened, just the jaw. Nothing else moved. 40, 30. The numbers kept falling the way she felt herself falling, floor by floor, through some house she hadn't chosen to live in. 20, 15. Because this was what it meant to be looked at and not seen, to stand 7 feet tall in a town of ordinary-sized cruelty and still be made small, which was its own kind of magic trick if you thought about it. Except she wasn't thinking about it. She was staring at a point on the far wall and counting her own heartbeat, because counting was the only thing left that was hers. $10. The auctioneer's voice had lost its showman's polish now. Just tired. $10. Somebody, she's got a strong back. I said that already.
5.
The word cut through the murmuring crowd, clean as a blade through green wood. Freya's eyes found him before her mind caught up to the sound. A man near the side wall, not young, not old. Somewhere in the hard middle years a man gets to, when the land has worked him as much as he's worked it. Broad through the shoulders in a way that wasn't showy about it. A coat gone thin at the elbows. Hat brim pulled low, but not low enough to hide the eyes underneath it, and the eyes were not laughing. He held up 2 coins between 2 fingers, like that was all he had left in the world, and maybe it was. The room went quiet in a way it hadn't been quiet all morning. The auctioneer blinked. $5. Do I hear? He looked around, almost desperate now, because $5 was an insult and everyone in the room knew it, and nobody wanted to be the second man to insult her worse. $5 going once, nobody moved. Going twice. Freya looked at the man who had spoken. Re-looked not at his coat, not at his coin. At his hands, folded loose at his sides, scarred the particular way rope and rock scar a man. Not the way whiskey and cruelty scar one. At his eyes, which had not once, not for 1 second, dropped to measure the size of her like the rest of the room had. He did not lower his hand. Not until the gavel came down. His name was Ezra Holloway. She learned that much before they even reached the wagon, because the auctioneer said it loud enough for the whole square to hear, the way a man announces something he once witnessed. Ezra Holloway, 34 years old. Ranch 2 hours north, going to seed the way half the ranches in this valley were going to seed, between the drought and the taxes, and whatever grief a man carries, quiet enough that the town stops asking about it after a while. He didn't offer his arm. He didn't offer anything, really, except a nod toward the wagon and a blanket, wool, worn thin at the corners, tossed onto the seat before she climbed up. She climbed up herself. She always climbed up herself. The ride out of town was silent except for the creak of the wheels and the wind starting to find its voice in the sage grass. Freya sat with her hands folded in her lap, the way she'd learned to sit when she wanted her hands to look smaller than they were, which was a lie her body had never quite managed to tell convincingly. Not at this size. Not ever. She waited until the town was a smudge behind them before she spoke. Why? Not a question, really. Not the way she said it. More like a demand thrown at the sky to see if it would answer. Ezra kept his eyes on the road. Why what? $5. Her accent thickened the words, the vowels rounder than his. A decade in this country, not enough to file them flat. You had more than that in your pocket. I saw the second coin. You've got sharp eyes. I've got a reason to. He was quiet a moment. The wagon jolted over a frozen rut, and she braced without thinking, one hand out to steady the crate behind her, because some habits a body keeps even when the mind is somewhere else entirely. What did you buy me for, she said, and this time it wasn't a demand. It was flatter than that, older than that. The voice of a woman who has asked this question of the world in several different languages and never once liked the answer. Ezra's jaw worked once. To survive. 2 words. He didn't dress them up, didn't explain the ranch, the drought, the taxes stacking up like snow against a door nobody had the strength left to shovel. Just those 2 words, laid down plain as a nail driven straight. Freya turned to look at him properly then, for the first time since the auction block, studied the line of his profile against the gray sky, waited for the lie to show itself, the way lies always did eventually, in the corner of a mouth, in eyes that wandered. His eyes didn't wander. To survive, she repeated, testing the words the way she'd test a blade for a hairline crack. Not to work a farm, not to warm a bed. I didn't say either of those. His voice stayed even. I said survive, because that's what it is out here, most years, and this year worse than most. She said nothing to that. There was nothing safe to say. So she turned her face back toward the road, toward the long gray miles ahead of them, and let the silence do the rest of the talking. The cabin sat low against a rise of dark pine, smoke already curling from a chimney that had clearly been banked before he left that morning. A small Mercy Freya noted and did not comment on. 1 window, 1 door, a barn that had seen better decades, a fence line that sagged in 3 places she could count from the wagon seat alone, and beyond it all, disappearing into the tree line, the black bones of something that had once been a forge. Roof half caved, bellows probably rotted through, but the shape of it, even ruined, made something in her chest tighten that had nothing to do with the cold. She didn't say anything about that, either, not yet. Inside, the cabin was 1 room, 1 bed, iron-framed, a quilt pieced together from fabric that had seen at least 2 other lives before this one. A table, 2 chairs, though only one looked steady on its legs. A stove that threw good heat, she'd give it that. There's a curtain, Ezra said, nodding toward a length of canvas strung on a wire, dividing off a corner no bigger than a horse stall, rigged it this morning. Didn't have time for more. Freya looked at the single bed. Looked at him. Looked back at the bed. I'll take the floor, he said, before she could ask, before the question could even fully form on her face. Got a bedroll. Done it plenty. You bought a ranch hand, she said. Not a guest. Bought a person, he said, and something flickered behind his eyes when he said it, something that might have been shame or might have been anger. She couldn't yet tell the difference on a stranger's face. Not livestock. There's a difference, whatever that auctioneer wants to call it. She didn't answer. She hung the thin coat on a peg by the door, and she noticed, without meaning to, that he'd hung his own coat on the peg beside it, not above it, not in some deliberate gesture of chivalry, just beside it, like it belonged there, like she belonged there. A small thing, She filed it away anyway, the way she filed away every small thing that might eventually add up into a reason to trust a man, or a reason not to. The storm came in before nightfall, the way storms did out here, without knocking first. Wind found every gap in the log walls and turned it into an instrument. Snow came sideways, then straight down, then sideways again, undecided, furious about it. Ezra banked the stove twice as high as usual and didn't apologize for the wood he was burning through. They ate in near silence. Salt pork, beans, bread gone a little stale but still bread, more food in one sitting than Freya had allowed herself in longer than she wanted to count. She ate carefully at first, the way a person eats when they've learned hunger can turn on you if you trust it too fast. Then less carefully. Then, for a few minutes, not carefully at all. Ezra didn't watch her do it. That was its own kind of gift, she thought. Not watching. Your father, he said finally, when the plates were empty and the wind had settled into a long, low howl that would likely last until morning. The auctioneer said something. Blacksmith. Freya's hand stilled around her cup. Anders Lindqvist. She said the name like it still had weight because it did. Best smith between here and the coast, before any of it. We came from Sweden when I was 16. He said America had room for a man who could shape iron, and didn't mind shaping his own future while he was at it. Did it for a while. Her voice didn't crack. She'd trained it not to, the same way she'd trained her face. There was a debt. Papers he signed trusting a man he shouldn't have trusted. Papers I still don't fully understand, because by the time I understood enough to fight them, my father was already 6 months in the ground, and the men holding the papers had already decided what came next for me. Was quiet. The fire popped once sharp, and neither of them flinched. He died believing he'd fixed it, she said. That's the part I can't put down. He died thinking he'd saved me from all of it, and you found out different. I found out different at an auction block. Flat. Final. A door closing on the subject, and Ezra had the sense not to try the handle again. Instead, he said after a while, staring into the stove's small orange window, my wife, Margaret. 5 years gone this spring. He didn't look at Freya when he said it. Fever took her over 2 winters. Slow. I kept thinking each one would be the one that turned it around. A pause. It never turned around. Neither of them cried. Neither of them reached for the other. Not that first night. Not with a curtain strung crooked across one corner of a one-room cabin, and a storm doing all the screaming that needed doing for both of them. But something passed between them anyway. Something that didn't have a name yet. Respect, maybe. Or the first cousin of it. The kind of quiet 2 people build when they've both been ruined by circumstances neither of them chose, and neither one flinches from saying so. Ezra laid his bedroll by the stove. Freya lay behind the canvas curtain, in a bed too short for her, the way every bed in this country was too short for her. Knees bent, boots off for the first time in 3 days. She listened to the storm. She listened to him breathing on the other side of that thin canvas wall. And for the first time since her father's grave, she slept the whole night through. The week that followed taught the ranch what it had bought, whether it wanted the lesson or not. Freya was up before Ezra most mornings, which surprised him exactly once before he learned not to be surprised by anything she did. She split wood in a fraction of the time it usually took, the axe swinging in her hands, like it weighed nothing, like the whole tree had personally offended her, and this was simply the correction. She mended a fence line alone that Ezra had been putting off fixing for weeks because it needed 2 men, and he'd only ever had himself. She didn't ask for thanks, which was good because at first he didn't quite know how to give it. He'd stand at a distance, working some other corner of the ranch, and watch her haul a log 2 men would have struggled to shift, and something in his chest would go tight and quiet. Not pity, nothing close to pity. Something more like witnessing a thing done exactly right for the first time in a long while. You don't have to prove anything, he told her. The 3rd day, when she was hauling fence posts that should have taken until dusk and had instead taken until noon. She didn't stop working. I'm not proving. I'm working. There's a difference, whatever people want to call it. He recognized his own words thrown back at him and said nothing further. She refused a dress the 2nd morning, when he'd found one, an old thing, of Margaret's. He'd kept folded at the bottom of a trunk for no reason he could name, and offered it without thinking too hard about what he was offering. Freya looked at it the way she might look at a trap. I work in trousers, she said. I've always worked in trousers. A dress won't change what I am, it'll only slow down what I do. He didn't argue. He put the dress back in the trunk and didn't take it out again. That was the shape of those first days. Small tests, offered and answered, neither of them quite naming what was being tested. Freya watching to see if kindness came with a hidden bill attached. Ezra watching to see if the woman he'd bought for $5, out of some instinct he still couldn't fully explain to himself, was going to need saving, or was going to do the saving herself given half a chance. She never needed saving. Not once that week. Which, if he was honest with himself late at night, staring at the low stove coals, unsettled him more than it should have, because he'd built a whole grief around being the man who couldn't save anybody. Margaret. The ranch. Whatever came next. And here was a woman who didn't need him to be anything other than a man who'd raised his hand at the right moment. She found the forge on the fourth evening. She hadn't been looking for it. Not exactly, though maybe some part of her had been. The way a compass needle finds north, whether or not the hand holding it means to point it there. She'd gone behind the barn chasing a hen that had gotten loose in the last of the daylight, and there it was, half swallowed by dead brush and one collapsed section of roof. The forge. Rusted, silent, abandoned so long the bellows had rotted clean off their hinges. But the stone base was sound. The chimney draw, when she checked it with a hand cup to catch the air, still pulled true. She stood there a long time in the failing light, one hand flat against the cold stone, and something moved behind her ribs that she hadn't let move in 8 months. Not since her father's forge back east had gone cold the last time, sold along with everything else to men who'd never once asked what it had cost him to build. Ezra found her there when he came looking, worried, half convinced the hen had led her into some trouble. She didn't turn around when she heard his boots in the snow. This was a forge, long time back. Fellow before me, or the fellow before him. Never had the coin or the time to fix it up proper. May I 2 words. The first thing she'd asked him for since the auction block, and something in the asking of it, and the way her voice went quieter than he'd heard it go all week, told him exactly how much it cost her to ask it all. It's yours to fix if you want it, he said. Anything you make on it, half's yours. That's fair, and I'll not pretend otherwise. She turned then. Looked at him properly the way she had that first day in the wagon, weighing him for the lie that wasn't there. And for the first time since the gavel came down in that auction square, Freya Lindqvist smiled. Not wide. Not long. Just a small crack in the ice she'd built around her own face, gone almost as quick as it came. But he saw it, and something in him, some door he'd nailed shut 5 years back, when Margaret stopped breathing, creaked open half an inch, whether he'd given it permission to or not. It was the following week, with the first real repairs underway on the forge, that Ambrose Marlowe came riding up the frozen track from town. Old man. Older than his years. The way men get, who've spent decades underground in the mining camps, breathing what a body was never built to breathe. He had a wagon of odds and scrap iron he traded across 3 counties, and a reputation for knowing more about the old families of this territory than the territory's own records office did. He found Freya at the forge, sleeves rolled despite the cold, hammering a bent hinge back into true sparks jumping gold against the gray afternoon. He stopped his wagon so sharp the horse startled. That hammer, he said, before he'd even climbed down. His voice had gone strange, thin. Where in God's name did you come by that hammer? Freya's hand stilled on the handle. She looked down at it, the worn leather grip, the head balanced just so, the small mark stamped into the iron near the base, that most men wouldn't even notice unless they knew to look. It was my father's, she said carefully. Anders Lindqvist. Why? The old man climbed down, slow, like his knees had opinions about the speed, and crossed the yard until he was close enough to see the mark clear. A.L. He read aloud, though he plainly didn't need to read it, plainly had known what it said before he ever climbed down from that wagon. His eyes lifted to her face, and something in them had gone wet and wide all at once. You're his daughter, you're Anders's girl. Freya's breath caught somewhere in her chest and refused for a moment to move on through. You knew my father, knew him. Ambrose let out a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Girl, your father pulled me out of a collapsed shaft outside Butte, with his own 2 hands. Back before you were more than a rumor to him. Pulled 3 other men out same night. Never asked for a thing in return, not so much as a drink, though God knows we tried to buy him one. He shook his head slowly, staring at the hammer like it was a ghost holding itself together with leather and iron. I heard he'd passed. Heard it second hand, months late, the way you hear things when you're 3 counties over. and don't have a home to send word to. I never knew what became of his people. There was only me, Freya said quietly. There's only ever been me. Ambrose's gaze slid past her then, to the man standing a little back from the forge, arms crossed, watching this whole exchange, with an expression Freya hadn't yet learned to read on him. And you, the old man said, something shifting in his voice, something almost like disbelief folding into recognition. Ezra Holloway, you bought Anders Lindquist's own daughter off an auction block for $5, and you didn't even know it. Ezra went very still. What are you talking about? He said low. Ambrose looked between them both, the daughter and the man, standing on either side of a forge that had sat cold and dead until 3 days ago, and something in the old miner's weathered face went soft with the particular ache of watching a debt finally circle back around to be paid. Butte, he said again. 69. Shaft collapse. 3 men trapped, one of them you, though I'd wager you remember the name of the fellow who dug you out with his bare hands before the timber gave way for good. He nodded at Freya, at the hammer still gripped in her scarred fist. That was her father. Anders Lindquist saved your life, Mr. Holloway. 5 years before you ever raised your hand in that square and didn't know why. The wind moved through the pines, behind the cabin, slow and deliberate, and for a long moment, nobody spoke at all. Ezra's eyes found Freya's face. Something had cracked open in him too now, some old debt he hadn't known. He was carrying, suddenly given a name, a weight, a woman standing right in front of him, with her father's hammer still warm from the forge. I didn't know, he said, and his voice had gone rougher than she'd heard it yet. I swear to you, I didn't know who you were when I raised my hand. I believe you, Freya said, and found, strangely, that she meant it. Because there are debts a person carries without ever knowing the shape of them. And because some hands get raised for reasons the raising man won't understand until years later. Standing in a snow-dusted yard, staring at a woman who has just become something more complicated to him than a bargain struck at $5. Ambrose stayed for supper that night and told stories deep into the evening about a blacksmith who never, once, in all his years in this territory, let a debt owed to him outweigh a debt he owed to someone else. Freya listened to every word like a woman starving for them, which, in a way she hadn't let herself admit until that night she was. Rutherford Vane heard about the Holloway sale, 3 days after it happened, secondhand, over a card table in the back room of the Ashford Creek Saloon, and he did not laugh the way the other men at the table laughed. He was a man built for rooms like that one. Good coat, better boots, a face that had learned early how to look pleasant while calculating something entirely unpleasant behind it. He owned more of the valley than any 3 ranchers combined. Timber contracts, mining claims, a controlling hand in the bank that decided who got a season's grace on their taxes and who didn't. $5, one of the men at the table said, still chuckling. For a giantess, Holloway's either a fool or he's got more nerve than sense. Which is it, you figure, said another. Vane said nothing for a moment. He was turning a fact over in his mind, the way he turned over every fact that crossed his table, looking for the angle nobody else had thought to look for. Holloway's ranch, he said finally, setting down his cards. Remind me. That's the parcel up along the North Fork. That's the one. Going to seed, from what I hear. Taxes are eating him alive. And the well, Vane said, very quiet, the one his grandfather dug. Deep one, wasn't it? Struck something near 40 feet down nobody else in the valleys managed to strike. The table went a little quiet at that, because it was the kind of quiet that came whenever Vane's voice dropped into that particular register. The register men in this valley had learned meant he was no longer making conversation. Come to think of it, one man said slowly, with the way this drought's shaping up, Vane finished for him, and something moved behind his pleasant, calculating face that was not pleasant at all. Ezra Holloway is sitting on the only reliable water in 12 miles of parched valley, and he doesn't even know it yet. Not the way I know it. He set his cards face down and did not pick them back up, because a man like Vane did not see a rancher and a blacksmith's daughter building something new out of cold iron and colder circumstance. He saw an asset, unclaimed, undervalued, ripe for the taking, the same way he'd seen every other piece of this valley before he'd taken it. One signature, one debt, one quiet ruin at a time. Which meant, though neither Ezra nor Freya knew it yet, standing together in the glow of a forge fire 2 hours north, warming their hands and their fragile new trust against a cold that had not yet begun to show its worst, that the real winter of that year had not yet arrived at all. It was only just now saddling up in town, counting its coin and starting, very quietly, to plan. The first trip into town came 10 days after the auction, and Freya nearly refused to go at all. Ezra hadn't ordered her to come along. He'd only mentioned, over breakfast, that he was riding in for supplies, flour running low, coal oil lower still, and that the wagon had room for two if she wanted the air. She hadn't wanted the air. She'd wanted, if she was honest with the small, cold voice in the back of her skull, to never set foot in Ashford Creek again as long as she lived. But the forge needed coal she couldn't dig from the ground herself, and pride, she'd learned a long time ago, made a poor substitute for iron. So she went, sat straight-backed on the wagon seat, coat buttoned to the throat, and watched the town rise up out of the flat gray morning like something she'd once escaped and was now being dragged back toward by the collar. The stairs started before the wagon even stopped. Because word travels fast in a town, that size, faster than snow melts, faster than shame fades, everyone knew by now, the rancher and the giantess. $5. There'd been laughter about it in 3 different saloons already. Ezra had heard, though he hadn't told her that part, hadn't seen the use in it. A woman on the boardwalk pulled her daughter close as they passed, the gesture small and quick and utterly unmistakable. Freya kept her eyes forward, kept her spine straight, because she would not. She told herself she would absolutely not give this town the satisfaction of watching her shrink, except her hands were shaking a little, tucked into her coat where nobody could see them, which she hated more than the stairs themselves. Inside the mercantile, the shopkeeper's wife, a thin, sharp-faced woman named Mrs. Dillard, looked Freya up and down with an expression that had clearly been practiced in a mirror. Well, she said, to no one in particular, though everyone in the store heard it. Guess Holloway got himself quite the bargain. Nobody laughed this time, but nobody stopped her either. Frey set a small sack of nails on the counter, hard enough that the coins inside her purse jumped. I'll take 5 pounds of coal if you've got it to spare. We've got it. Mrs. Dillard's eyes flicked toward the door, toward Ezra, who'd just stepped in behind her, coal oil can in one hand. Didn't know you were setting up a smithy out there, Mr. Holloway. Didn't figure you had the coin for hired labor, let alone forged stock. I don't have hired labor, Ezra said, voice even, unhurried. I've got a partner. There's a difference. Mrs. Dillard's mouth pinched into something that wanted to be a smile and couldn't quite manage it. Is that what they're calling it now? That's what I'm calling it, Ezra said, because that's what it is. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. There was something in the flatness of it, the sheer refusal to be baited, that made Mrs. Dillard's sharp face falter just slightly, just enough that she busied herself weighing coal, instead of finding another word to say. Freya said nothing through the whole exchange. But something in her chest had gone tight and strange, and it took her most of the ride back to the ranch to understand what it was. Nobody had defended her like that before. Not once. Not in 8 years in this country. Not even her own father, God rest him, who had loved her fiercely, but had never once had to defend her from a room, because he'd never once let her stand in a room that might turn on her. Ezra hadn't asked if she wanted defending. He'd simply done it, the way he did most things, without ceremony, without expecting thanks. You didn't have to say that, she told him finally, when the town was well behind them and the road had gone quiet again except for the wheels and the wind. Didn't have to, Ezra agreed. Wanted to. Why? He was quiet a moment, eyes on the road, the same way he'd been quiet in that very same wagon 10 days before, weighing an answer before he gave it. Because it's true, he said finally, and because I'm tired of this valley, deciding what a person's worth before it's bothered to ask. Freya looked away, out over the frozen grass, and did not let him see whatever was happening on her face just then. But something had shifted. Some door that had been bolted since the day the auctioneer called her lot number had come, if not open, then at least unlocked. They picked up a hired hand in town that same trip, though neither of them had planned to. His name was Cyrus Pruitt, a drifter, in his late 20s with an easy laugh and quicker hands, the kind of man who'd worked half the ranches in 3 territories and stayed at none of them long. He'd heard, the way everyone in Ashford Creek had heard, that Holloway's place was short-handed and about to get busy. What with a forge going back into operation and a woman on the property who could apparently do the work of 2 men on her own. Heard you need help you can trust, Cyrus said, leaning against the mercantile's porch post. with the easy confidence of a man who'd talked his way into a dozen jobs the same way. I work hard. Don't ask questions I don't need to ask. Don't eat much if that matters to you. Ezra studied him a long moment. There was nothing obviously wrong with the man. Good references, or references good enough for a drifter's word to carry. A firm handshake, eyes that met yours, and didn't flinch away. $1 a week and board, Ezra said. You pull your weight, that arrangement holds. You don't. It doesn't. Fair enough, Cyrus grinned. Easy as anything. Wouldn't expect different from a man who paid $5 for the best deal in this whole territory. He said it without malice, the way a man says a thing he's genuinely decided to admire, rather than mock. And something in the phrasing, in the grin behind it, made Freya, watching from the wagon seat, decide she didn't entirely trust him. She couldn't have said why. Not then. It was nothing she could point to, no single word or gesture. Just an old instinct, honed over years of learning which smiles meant kindness, and which ones meant a man was already calculating how to use you. She said nothing about it. Not yet. There was nothing yet to say. The forge came fully back to life in the second week of that November, and Freya marked the occasion the only way she knew how to mark anything that mattered. She worked. The first true fire she lit in, that rebuilt hearth roared up gold and orange against the gray afternoon, and she stood before it, with her sleeves rolled, despite the cold, and something in her chest unclenched that had been clenched. She realized only now, since the morning her father's fort back east had gone cold for the final time. Ezra came to watch, the second evening, standing at a respectful distance the way he'd learned to stand around her work, close enough to see, far enough not to intrude. You're different here, he said, watching her turn a glowing bar of iron with practiced tongs, watching the hammer come down in a rhythm that seemed less like labor and more like a language only she and the metal understood. Different how? Lighter. He considered the word, turned it over. No, that's not it. Steadier. Like this is the one place the world isn't asking you to prove something. Freya's hammer paused mid-swing, just for a heartbeat, before continuing its rhythm. Because it isn't, she said finally. Iron doesn't care what I look like. Iron only cares if I know what I'm doing. And do you? She looked up at him then, and something dry and almost playful moved behind her tired eyes, the first hint of humor he'd seen from her since the auction block. My father apprenticed me from the age of 9. I forged more steel than most men in this territory have ever touched. So yes, I know what I'm doing, Ezra. Almost smiled. Fair enough. He picked up the bellows without being asked, and worked them steady while she shaped the iron, and for a long while neither of them spoke at all, because there was nothing that needed saying over the rhythm of hammer and heat and two people learning, slowly, wordlessly, how to work as one thing instead of two. It was, Freya thought later, lying awake behind the canvas curtain, and listening to him breathe on the other side of it, the first time in longer than she could remember that a man's presence beside her had felt like less weight instead of more. She did not examine that thought too closely. She was not ready for what she might find if she did. By the end of the month, the forge had produced enough stock, horseshoes, nails, a handful of hunting knives, a set of hinges for a rancher too far over who'd heard the rumors and decided to test them, that Ezra loaded the wagon for the 2-day ride to the mining camp at Coldwater Gulch. Freya wanted to go. She said so plainly, no hedging, no waiting to be asked. It's rough country between here and there, Ezra said. Rougher company at the other end. I've survived rougher. Her voice left no room for argument, and it's my iron, Mr. Holloway. I'll see where it goes. He didn't argue further. They left before dawn, Cyrus staying behind to mind the ranch, and the 2 days on the road passed in a rhythm that had started, without either of them quite noticing when to feel less like tolerance and more like company. Coldwater Gulch was everything the name suggested, and worse, a raw scar of a mining camp clinging to a canyon wall, men living hard and working harder, the air thick with wood smoke and desperation in equal measure. But the moment word went around that a smith had arrived with fresh stock, honest stock, not the overpriced, underweight garbage the company store usually pushed, men lined up with coin in hand. Freya sold every horseshoe she'd brought within the first hour. The knives went almost as fast, miners running work-worn thumbs along the edges and nodding the particular nod of men who know good steel when they feel it. $47. Ezra said that evening, counting the take by lantern light in the back of the wagon, his voice carrying something close to disbelief. $47, Freya. That's near half what I owe on this year's taxes, made in one afternoon. Freya said nothing for a moment, staring at the small stack of coin like it might vanish if she looked away from it too long. It's real, Ezra said, watching her face. It's yours. Half of it, like I said it would be. I know it's real. Her voice had gone rough, unsteady in a way she hadn't allowed it to go since the day of the auction. I just haven't earned honest coin with my own two hands in 8 months. I'd forgotten what it felt like. Ezra didn't say anything to that. He didn't need to. He simply reached over, in the lantern light, and closed his hand briefly over hers, over the coin, and let it rest there a moment before pulling back, because there are some silences that say more than any words could manage, and both of them understood, without either one naming it, that this was one of them. It was on the ride back from Coldwater Gulch, near dusk on the second day, that they passed a rider going the opposite direction, well-dressed, well-mounted, a man who didn't belong on that rough track any more than a silk shirt belonged in a coal mine. He nodded at them as he passed, polite, unhurried. His eyes lingered a moment too long on the ranch brand burned into their wagon sideboard, and a moment longer still on Freya herself, cataloging something behind his pleasant expression that neither of them could name yet. Who was that, Freya asked, once he'd passed out of earshot. Ezra's jaw had gone tight in a way she hadn't seen before. Rutherford Vane. Owns half this valley one way or another. Timber, mining claims, more of the bank than any honest man ought to own outright. He looked at the wagon like he was pricing it. Vane looks at everything like he's pricing it, Ezra said, and there was something in his voice now that hadn't been there a moment before, something wary and old, the voice of a man who had watched this particular kind of storm gather before and knew exactly how much damage it could do once it broke. Best hope he's got no cause to look twice. Freya said nothing further, but she turned in her seat once, watching the well-dressed rider disappear over a low rise, and something cold moved through her that had nothing to do with the falling temperature of the coming night. Vane rode straight back to Ashford Creek, and did not stop at the saloon that evening. He rode instead to the small office above the bank, where he kept his private ledgers, the ones that recorded not dollars and cents, but debts and leverage, the true currency of everything he'd built in this valley. He lit a lamp. He pulled a survey map from a locked drawer, unrolled it across the desk, and traced one finger north along the valley floor until it stopped, precisely, on a small parcel marked in faded ink with a name he already knew well, Holloway. Beside the parcel, in his own hand, added some years back when he'd first begun cataloging the valley's water rights, with the patience of a man who understood that drought was not a disaster but an opportunity, waiting to mature, was a single word underlined twice. Well, the only reliable well left in 12 miles of parched, worsening country, sitting on the land of a rancher too proud and too broke to know what he was truly sitting on. A rancher who had apparently just found himself a smith with a gift for turning scrap iron into gold. And a woman, Vane thought, recalling the way she'd sat straight-backed in that wagon, chin high, eyes sharp enough to notice him noticing her, who was going to be considerably more trouble to remove from that land than her modest purchase price had suggested. Trouble was not the same thing as impossible. Vane smiled, the pleasant, calculating smile that had built him half a valley, one ruined family at a time, and reached for a fresh sheet of paper. Because a man did not become the richest fool in Ashford Creek by respecting fences, and because there was more than one way to pry a well loose from a stubborn rancher's hands, especially once winter tightened its grip and the drought behind it began, slowly, patiently, to show its true and ruinous teeth. He began to write. The first letters went out 3 days later, quiet inquiries to the county land office, to the bank's own tax rolls, to a surveyor he kept on a private retainer for exactly this kind of delicate work. All of it small, all of it deniable, all of it aimed, with the patience of a man who had never once needed to hurry, at a ranch 2 hours north where a rancher and a blacksmith's daughter were, for now, still warming their hands together at a forge fire, believing, for a little while longer, that the worst of the winter had already found them and passed. It had not passed. It had only just begun to gather. The town held its winter social the first Saturday of December, in the long room above the feed store, and Ezra almost didn't mention it to her at all. He mentioned it anyway over supper, careful and offhand, the way a man mentions something he expects to be refused. Whole valley turns out for it. Music. Food everybody brings a dish for. Not obligated to go. Freya turned her fork over once, twice before she answered. You think I'm afraid of a room full of people who've already decided what they think of me. Didn't say afraid, you thought it. He didn't deny it, which she respected, more than she would have respected a denial. I'll go, she said finally. Because if I hide from every room in this valley, I'll spend the rest of my life hiding, and I already spent 8 months doing that. I'm finished with it. So she went. Wore the one good dress she owned, dark blue wool, sewn by her own hands 2 winters back in a life that felt now like it belonged to someone else, and stood in the doorway of that long room above the feed store with her chin level and her shoulders square, the way her father had taught her to stand in any room, friendly or not. The room went quiet, the way rooms had gone quiet for her before. But it didn't stay quiet. Somebody started the fiddle up again, a little too loud, a little too fast, the way people cover an awkward silence with noise, and the moment passed the way moments do, whether you're ready for them to or not. Ezra found her a chair near the wall, brought her a plate without asking, and did not leave her side for the better part of an hour, not because she needed guarding, but because, she realized slowly, he simply preferred to be near her, and had stopped pretending otherwise sometime in the last month, without either of them marking the exact day it happened. You don't have to stand watch, she told him, amused despite herself. Not standing watch, he handed her a cup of cider. Just don't much care for the rest of this room tonight. Something warm moved through her chest at that, unbidden, unwelcome, in the way that all the best feelings are unwelcome when a person has spent years teaching herself not to want things she couldn't keep. It was near the end of the evening, when the fiddle slowed into something gentler, that Ezra stood and held out one scarred hand and asked her, plain and quiet, without any of the nervous fumbling a lesser man might have brought to the question, if she'd care to dance. Freya looked at his hand, looked at the room, half of which had already turned to watch, curious, some of them still unkind, most of them simply curious the way people are curious about anything they haven't seen before. She thought about refusing, thought about how a giantess and a rancher of ordinary height would look, moving together across that narrow floor, an image the town would surely turn into a joke before the night was through. Then she thought about her father, who had never once in his life let another man's laughter decide what he did with his own hands. She took Ezra's hand. They did not dance well, not in any way that would have impressed a dancing master. He had to reach up. She had to bend her steps small and careful, the way she bent everything about herself in rooms built for smaller people. But they moved together, slow, steady, and for the length of that one song, the room's opinion of them stopped mattering to either one of them at all. Somewhere near the back of the room, Rutherford Vane stood near the punch table, watching the two of them turn together beneath the lamplight, and his pleasant, calculating face did not change expression even slightly, though something behind his eyes was already busy, already counting, already deciding that whatever was growing between that rancher and that blacksmith's daughter was going to need to be accounted for in whatever came next. Freya didn't see him watching. Ezra did, for one brief moment over her shoulder, and something cold moved it through him that he did not yet have words for and chose, for that one night at least, to set aside. They rode home late, under a sky gone thick with stars, and neither of them said much for the first mile. The kind of comfortable quiet two people build once talking has stopped being the only way they know how to be close-eyed to each other. Thank you, Freya said finally, for the dance. Wasn't much of a dance, it was enough. She looked over at him, starlight catching the line of his jaw, and something in her chest ached in a way she hadn't let it ache in longer than she could remember. Nobody's ever asked me before. Not once. In 8 years in this country. Ezra's hands tightened slightly on the reins. Their loss, he said, simple as anything, and meant it so plainly that Freya had to look away, out at the dark fields, to keep whatever was happening in her eyes from showing on her face. They rode the rest of the way in silence. But it was a different silence than the one they'd started with, back on that first wagon ride from the auction block. A silence that had learned, somewhere in the last month, how to hold two people instead of keeping them apart. Cyrus Pruitt watched them ride in that night from the doorway of the barn, arms crossed, an expression on his easy face that wasn't quite as easy as usual. He'd been asked a good many questions in town that same evening, while Freya and Ezra were upstairs at the social. A well-dressed man he didn't recognize at first, until somebody murmured Vane's name near him at the bar, had bought him 2 drinks and asked in the friendliest possible way how the Holloway place was getting on, how the new forge was doing. whether the well out there really ran as deep and steady as old rumor claimed, even through a dry season like this one. Cyrus hadn't thought much of it at the time. Friendly questions, friendly drinks, the kind of small talk a man made when he was bored and rich and looking to fill an evening. But standing in the cold barn doorway now, watching Ezra help Freya down from the wagon with a gentleness that hadn't been there a month ago, watching the two of them stand a moment too long in the yard before heading in, close together, easy together, Cyrus found himself turning the conversation over again in his mind, and liking the shape of it less each time he did. He said nothing. Not that night. There was nothing yet worth saying, and $1 a week in board was $1 a week in board, whatever a rich man in town happened to be curious about. But he filed the conversation away, the same careful way Freya had once filed away small kindnesses, and did not mention it to anyone at the ranch at all. The second week of December brought the first real cold snap of the winter, cold enough that Freya kept the forge burning near around the clock, both for the work and for the simple animal comfort of standing near something warm. It was on one of those long, quiet evenings that she finally made herself open the second crate she'd carried all the way from New York, and never once fully unpacked, her father's old tool chest, too painful to sort through in the raw months right after his death. She'd only meant to find the second leather apron she remembered him, keeping folded away at the bottom of it. She found the apron. She found something else besides, tucked inside the lining, in the place her father had always hidden anything he judged worth protecting, was a folded paper, brittle at the creases, the ink gone the particular brown-black of age. Her hands went very still. She carried it to the table without quite trusting her own legs, to walk steady, and unfolded it there with the same care she gave a piece of good steel, and stared down at ink that had waited years. She now understood, for the one person left in the world with any right to read it, Ezra. He was beside her within moments, reading over her shoulder. "This is my father's hand," Freya said very quietly. "I'd know it anywhere. It's some manner of land claim, I think, filed under his name. But I can't make full sense of half these markings. Compass bearings. A creek. A ridge line he's drawn by hand instead of any proper survey." Ezra studied it a long moment, brow furrowed. Near 30 years old by this date. Filed before either of us was much more than a thought, he looked up at her. "I don't know this territory well enough to place these markings myself, but I know a man who might." Ambrose Marlowe's wagon came creaking back up the frozen track 3 days later, and Freya met him in the yard before he'd even fully climbed down, the folded paper already in her hand. "Didn't expect to need you again so soon," she said. "But I found something at the bottom of my father's tool chest, and I'm hoping you can help me understand it." Ambrose took the paper carefully, the way an old man takes anything he suspects might be more fragile than it looks, and read it slow, lips moving faintly over the old-fashioned script. "Land claim," he said finally. "Filed near 30 years back when your father first came west scouting for a place to settle, before he ever went east again for you and your mother." He turned the paper over, studying the hand-drawn markings on the reverse. "Can't say for certain without the county plats to compare against. Old claim like this, boundaries drawn by a man walking the land himself with a compass and a length of rope, not some fancy surveyor's transit." He nodded, slow toward the dark shape of the ranch house behind them, the barn, the forge glowing low and steady in the December night. "But near as I can reckon from these landmarks he's noted here, it runs awful close to this very ranch, Mr. Holloway. Might even run straight through the middle of where we're standing." Nobody spoke for a long moment. The cold pressed in around the three of them, and the forge's coals ticked and settled in the silence, and somewhere out past the tree line, an owl called once and went quiet. "That can't be right," Ezra said finally, though his voice had gone careful in a way that suggested he already suspected it might be exactly right. "Might not be," Ambrose agreed. "Might be nothing at all. Old claims lapse. Get bought out, sold off, folded into bigger parcels, by men with lawyers and money enough to make problems disappear on paper." His gaze flicked toward the road, toward town, toward everything that lay beyond this quiet, cold yard. "But if I were you two, I'd keep this paper somewhere safe. And I'd keep it quiet a good while longer, until you know for certain what you're holding." Freya folded the paper back along its old brittle creases, slow, deliberate, and held it against her chest like something that might shatter if she wasn't careful with it. Her father's hand, her father's claim, a piece of him, still out here in this cold valley 30 years later, waiting, it seemed, for her to come and find it herself. "Thank you," she said to Ambrose, and her voice had gone thick in a way she didn't try to hide. Not this time. Not from this old man who had known her father's kindness firsthand. "For helping me understand what I'm holding. For all of it." Ambrose patted her arm, once gentle. The way a person touches something they understand is more fragile than it looks. "Your father dug 3 men out of a collapsed shaft with his bare hands and never once asked for thanks," he said. "Least I can do is help his own girl make sense of what she found, now that she's dug it up herself." He left soon after, wagon creaking back down the frozen track under a sky gone hard and bright with stars, and Freya stood a long while at the forge after he'd gone, the old claim still held against her chest, staring into coals that had, for once, stopped holding her full attention. "What are you thinking?" Ezra asked quietly, coming to stand beside her. "I'm thinking," Freya said slowly, "that my father left me more than a hammer after all. I just didn't know it until tonight." Ezra looked at her a long moment, the firelight catching the exhaustion and the wonder both tangled together on her face, and did not say what he was thinking, which was that if the old man's memory proved right, if that claim truly ran through this land, then everything he thought he owned, everything he'd been fighting the bank and the drought and his own grief to hold on to for 5 long years, might not have been entirely his to hold in the first place. He did not say it. Not that night. There would be time enough, he told himself, to untangle whatever this old paper meant, once winter loosened its grip, and the county plats could be checked, and the truth, whatever shape it finally took, could be faced properly, together, instead of guessed at by lantern light in a frozen yard. He did not yet know how little time winter was actually going to give them. 3 days later, a stranger rode up the frozen track just past noon, dressed too well for honest ranch work, a leather satchel of surveying instruments strapped behind his saddle. He introduced himself as a county surveyor, sent to update old boundary records ahead of the spring assessments, and he smiled the whole time he said it, pleasant and unbothered, the kind of smile that had clearly been practiced on a great many doorsteps before this one. Freya, splitting kindling near the barn, watched him from a distance and felt something old and wary rise up the back of her neck. The same instinct that had never once trusted Cyrus Pruitt's easy grin. Because a county surveyor, she thought, setting down the axe, did not usually ride out this deep into a valley in the dead of winter over nothing more than paperwork, which meant somebody, somewhere, had decided this particular stretch of land was suddenly worth the trouble of checking. And she had a fairly good idea, watching the well-dressed stranger unpack his instruments with unhurried care near the edge of the property, exactly whose curiosity had sent him out here in the first place. Ezra came out of the cabin to meet the man, polite but guarded, the way he'd learned to be guarded around anything connected, even loosely, to Rutherford Vane's name. "Didn't know the county sent surveyors out in December," he said. The stranger's smile didn't waver. "Special circumstances. Drought's got everybody nervous about water rights this year. County wants clear records before spring, before things get, well." He glanced, just briefly, just for a heartbeat, toward the well house, toward the old iron pump handle visible against the snow. "Before things get contested." "Nothing here to contest," Ezra said. Flat. "Course not." The surveyor's smile widened. "Easy. Untroubled. Just doing my job, Mr. Holloway. Won't take more than an hour of your time." He took considerably more than an hour. And when he finally rode back down the frozen track toward town, satchel packed away, notes taken, Freya stood beside Ezra in the yard and watched him go with a coldness settling into her chest that had nothing at all to do with the December wind. "That wasn't the county," she said quietly, once the rider had disappeared over the low rise. "No," Ezra agreed, his voice gone hard in a way she hadn't heard from him before. "That wasn't the county." They stood together in the yard a long while after the man had gone, the forge smoke curling thin and gray against a white winter sky. The old land claim still folded carefully away inside the cabin, where Freya had hidden it beneath a loose floorboard 3 nights before. Neither of them said Vane's name out loud. They didn't need to, because somewhere down in Ashford Creek, a man with a pleasant calculating face was already counting the days until the deep freeze of true winter locked this valley down tight, already weighing exactly how much a stubborn rancher and an unbreakable blacksmith's daughter were going to cost him to remove from a piece of land that held, unbeknownst to either of them fully yet, far more history and far more danger than either one had bargained for. The forge fire burned on behind them, steady and gold against the coming dark. But for the first time since the gavel had fallen on a $5 bid in a crowded town square, Freya Lindqvist understood, standing in that cold yard with a stranger's dust still settling on the road, that the true fight for this valley had not yet even begun. It was only now quietly, patiently, starting to gather its strength. That night, Freya dreamed of the debt collectors, not the auction. She rarely dreamed of the auction, oddly enough, as though her mind had decided that particular humiliation was survivable simply because she had in fact survived it. No, what came back to her in the dark again and again, uninvited, was the morning 8 months before, when two men in city coats had come to the small rented rooms behind her father's cold forge and told her, without once meeting her eyes, that the debt was called, that the papers were binding, that a woman alone with no husband and no living father had exactly one kind of value left to offer against what was owed. In the dream, as in memory, she had stood in the doorway and told them her father would never have signed anything so foolish. And one of the men, the younger one, had looked at her then with something almost like pity and said the words that had haunted her every restless night since. He signed it to protect you. That's what fathers do. Sign things they shouldn't, so their daughters don't have to. She woke with a gasp that she swallowed before it could turn into a sound, sitting bolt upright in the too-short bed, heart slamming, the canvas curtain a pale gray shape in the dark. Freya. Ezra's voice, low from the other side of the curtain. Not asking if she was all right, simply there. Awake. Listening. I'm fine, she said, and her own voice betrayed her, thin and unsteady in a way it almost never was. A pause. Then the sound of him sitting up on his bedroll near the stove. Doesn't sound fine. She said nothing. Pulled her knees up under the quilt, wrapped her arms around them the way she used to as a girl, back before her body outgrew every room she was ever given, and stared at the dim shape of the curtain until her breathing slowed. You want to talk about it, Ezra said, or you want me to just sit here and not ask you to? Something about the offer, the plainness of it, the fact that he'd given her both doors, and let her choose which one to walk through, undid something in her that 8 months of grief and humiliation hadn't managed to undo. The men who took the debt, she said quietly into the dark. They came to our rooms the morning after the burial, 8 months ago. I hadn't even swept the ash out of his forge yet, and they told me he'd signed it to protect me. Her voice cracked, just slightly, just once, as if that made it a kindness instead of a trap. Ezra was quiet a long moment. She heard him move, heard the soft scrape of him standing, and then his shadow was there at the edge of the curtain, not pulling it back, not crossing whatever careful line they'd both been keeping since that first night, just standing close enough that she could hear him breathe. My father did something similar, he said finally. Not the same, but similar enough I understood it the day you told me about him. A pause. Signed over half our herd to a neighbor, one bad winter, to keep the bank off our land another season. Never told my mother till it was done. Said a man protects his family by making the hard choices himself, so they never have to carry the weight of choosing. Did it work? Freya asked. The protecting. For a while. Ezra's voice had gone rough. Then the neighbor called in the debt different than my father expected, and we lost the herd and half the land anyway, and my father spent the rest of his life believing he'd failed us, when really he'd just loved us in a way that cost more than he had to give. Freya pressed her forehead against her knees, and for the first time since the auction block, she let herself cry, quiet, careful tears, that she didn't bother hiding from the man on the other side of that thin canvas curtain, because something about his voice, his own old grief laid bare beside hers, made hiding feel suddenly unnecessary. I miss him, she said. I miss him so much some days I can't breathe around it. I know, Ezra said. I know exactly what that feels like. He didn't cross the curtain. He didn't need to. He simply stayed there, close, steady, until her breathing evened out again and the small hours of the night settled back into something almost peaceful. Thank you, she said finally, for not telling me it'll be all right. Don't know that it will be, Ezra admitted. Don't know what that surveyor's going to mean for either of us, come spring. But I know I'm not planning on facing it without you standing beside me. That much I'm sure of. Freya closed her eyes, and for the first time in 8 months, the grief settled into something almost bearable. Not gone, never gone, but carried now, she understood, by more than just her own two hands. Neither am I, she said quietly into the dark. Whatever's coming. I'm not facing it alone either. Outside, the December wind moved low and steady through the pines, and the forge sat banked and quiet behind the barn, waiting for morning, waiting for the next fire to be lit, the next piece of iron, to be shaped into something strong enough to hold. And somewhere down in Ashford Creek, behind a locked office door, a man with a pleasant, calculating face slept easy that night, certain, in the particular arrogance of men who have never once lost anything they truly wanted, that a rancher's pride and a giantess's stubbornness were no match at all for patience, paperwork, and a drought that showed no sign of breaking. He did not yet understand what kind of iron he was about to test himself against. He would learn. Winter had only just begun. Morning came gray and hard, the way most Montana mornings did in the last weeks of that year, but Freya rose before the light the way she always did now, and found Ezra already at the stove, coffee going, his face carrying the particular stillness of a man who had spent half the night thinking instead of sleeping. "You didn't rest," she said. "Neither did you." "Fair enough." Neither of them argued the point. They ate in a silence that had, by now, stopped feeling like distance and started feeling like something closer to partnership. Two people who no longer needed to fill every quiet moment with words in order to feel understood. Outside, the forge sat cold, waiting for its fire. Beyond it, the fence lines held for now. Beyond that, the well pump stood dark and iron and utterly unremarkable to anyone who didn't know, as they now did, exactly what it might be worth to a man determined enough to take it. "I'll ride to the county seat," Ezra said, finally setting down his cup. "Once the road's clear enough to make the trip worth the risk. Check the plats myself. See what that old claim of your father's actually holds, before anybody else gets the chance to decide the answer for us." "I'm coming with you." He didn't argue that either. He'd learned, in the space of one short month, precisely which battles were worth fighting with her, and which ones weren't, and this, plainly, was not one of them. "All right," he said. "Together, then." Freya looked at him across the small table, at the man who had raised his hand for $5 in a crowded square, for reasons neither of them had fully understood at the time, and felt something settle into place inside her chest that had been unmoored since the morning her father died. Not safety, exactly. She had learned, the hard way, not to trust safety too quickly, but something close to it, something that felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, like the beginning of a life she might actually choose to keep. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the first hard bite of the deep winter still to come, and somewhere down the frozen track that connected this quiet ranch to the rest of the valley, a well-dressed man in a warm office was already unrolling a fresh survey map, already sharpening a pen, already beginning, with the patience of a man who had never once needed to hurry toward ruin, to plan exactly how he intended to take from them everything they had only just begun together to build. Freya did not know yet how close that ruin was riding. Neither did Ezra. But the forge fire would be lit again within the hour, gold and steady against the gray Montana morning, and whatever winter still had left to throw at them. Both of them had already decided, without needing to say it aloud, that they would meet it standing exactly where they now stood, together and not one step back. The roads cleared enough to travel by the second week of January, and Ezra and Freya rode the 2 days to the county seat together, the old claim folded careful inside Freya's coat, close against her heart, the way a person carries something they're not yet ready to lose. The land office smelled of dust and ink and old paper going slowly to ash. A clerk with spectacles and a tired mouth pulled down the county plats without much interest, until he actually looked at the date on Anders Lindqvist's claim, and something in his tired face sharpened. "This is old," he said. "Filed before the war. Near enough. Before half these parcels were even surveyed proper. Does it hold?" Ezra asked, flat. No patience left for softer questions. The clerk traced a finger along the plat map, comparing marks, comparing names, and the silence stretched long enough that Freya's hands went cold inside her gloves. "Boundary lines from claims this old," the clerk said slowly, "get folded into later surveys all the time. Sometimes clean, sometimes not." He looked up. "This one wasn't folded clean, Mr. Holloway. Near as these records show, the original Lindqvist claim runs straight through the northern third of your property." Including his finger stopped, tapped once, "including your well." Nobody spoke, because there it was, written down, official, a truth that had been sitting quiet in a dusty drawer for 30 years, waiting for a daughter to walk in and wake it up. "What happens now?" Freya asked, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Now," the clerk said, but he files to reassert the claim. Formally. Which means somebody's got to prove direct descent, prove the original claim was never properly abandoned or bought out. He glanced between them. And it means until that's settled, this land's got a cloud on its title neither one of you is going to like. Ezra's jaw worked once hard. How long to settle it? Months. Longer, if anybody with money decides to contest it. Freya already knew, standing in that dusty office with her father's handwriting pressed against her ribs, exactly who that somebody with money was going to be. Vane came to the ranch himself 11 days later. No surveyor sent ahead this time. No pretense. He rode up the frozen track in a coat that cost more than most men in this valley made in a season, and he did not dismount right away, just sat his horse in the yard, and looked at the place the way a man looks at something he has already decided, somewhere deep down, belongs to him. Mr. Holloway. Pleasant. Unhurried. Miss Lindqvist. A small nod toward Freya, and something in the way he said her name made her skin want to crawl straight off her body. I understand congratulations might be in order. Quite the discovery. A lost claim resurfacing after 30 years.
Word travels fast, Ezra said.
Word always travels fast in a valley this small. Vane finally swung down, unhurried, and Freya noted, the way she noted everything about a man she didn't trust, that his boots never once sank properly into the mud, like even the ground here was too poor for him to fully commit his weight to it. I'll be direct, since I understand directness is valued out here. I'd like to buy the claim. All of it. Generous terms. Enough to clear whatever's left on your taxes, Mr. Holloway, with a fair sum left over besides. Not for sale, Ezra said. Everything's for sale. Vane's smile didn't waver. The only question is whether the seller decides the price, or whether circumstance does. Is that a threat, Freya asked, stepping forward, and something about her rising to her full height, unhurried, deliberate, made even Vane's practiced calm flicker for half a heartbeat. It's an observation, Vane said. Drought years are hard on stubborn people, Miss Lindqvist. Harder sometimes than they realize until it's too late to change course. He mounted back up without waiting for an answer, and rode off unhurried the way he'd arrived, leaving behind a silence that sat in the yard like a held breath neither of them wanted to release. He's not going to stop, Freya said quietly. No, Ezra agreed. He's not. The sabotage started within the week. A fence line cut clean in the night, cattle scattered across 2 miles of frozen scrub before Ezra and Cyrus rode them back in, half frozen, half furious. A week after that, salt dumped in the trough by the north pasture, enough to sicken 2 head before anybody noticed what had happened. Coincidence, Cyrus offered. The second time, helping mend the cut wire, with hands that moved a little too fast, eyes that didn't quite settle anywhere for long. Wolves get into fences sometimes. Or drifters. Wolves don't carry wire cutters, Freya said, watching him work. Watching close. Because something about Cyrus had never sat right with her. Not since the mercantile. Not since that easy grin that had never once, in 3 months, quite reached all the way to his eyes. And now, watching him fumble an explanation that fit a little too smoothly, a little too fast, something cold and certain, settled into her chest. She said nothing yet. She only watched. Word of the sabotage spread through the valley the way bad news always spread faster than good, but it didn't spread the way Vane had likely hoped. Because a strange thing happened in those cold, hard weeks of late January. Ranchers who had laughed at Freya on the auction block, who had watched Mrs. Dillard sneer at her across a mercantile counter and said nothing to stop it, started showing up at the Holloway Forge with broken tools and quiet questions. Heard somebody's been leaning on you, old Silas, Braddock said, one gray morning, setting a cracked plow blade on Freya's work table, without much ceremony. Heard it might be a fellow with more money than manners. You heard right, Freya said, turning the blade over, assessing the break with a practiced eye. Figured as much. Braddock's weathered face didn't give much away, but something in the set of his jaw did. Man tried the same thing on my land 3 years back. Wanted my creek frontage. I told him where he could put his generous offer. A pause. Didn't expect he'd try it twice in one valley. Guess he's run out of easy targets. I'm not an easy target, Freya said. Braddock almost smiled. No, reckon you're not. He nodded toward the blade. Can you fix it? By tomorrow evening. Fair price, she agreed. He wasn't the only one. Over the following weeks, a slow trickle became a steady one. Ranchers and homesteaders from 3 separate corners of the valley. Most of them men who'd never once spoken a kind word to her in town, arriving instead at her forge with broken plowshares and busted hinges and a wordless kind of solidarity that took Freya considerably longer to trust than it took her to earn. "They're not doing this out of charity," she said to Ezra one evening, watching another wagon creak away down the frozen track, coin in her apron pocket, work waiting on her bench. "They're doing it because good steel is good steel, and because every one of them has their own history with a man like Vane." "Maybe," Ezra said. "Or maybe they're finally seeing what I saw that first day in the square." He shrugged, simple, unbothered by his own honesty. "Sometimes it just takes a while for a valley to catch up to the truth." Freya didn't answer that, but something in her chest, something that had been clenched tight and wary since long before the auction block, eased just slightly further, one quiet transaction at a time. It was Ambrose, riding through on his scrap wagon 2 weeks later, who finally gave the suspicion about Cyrus a shape. "Saw your hand in town," he told Ezra quiet, pulling him aside near the barn. Cyrus, deep in conversation with one of Vane's men, back corner of the saloon. Money changing hands. Didn't look like wages for honest work. Ezra's face went very still. "You're certain?" "Certain as these old eyes get." Ambrose's mouth thinned. "Wouldn't say it if I wasn't." That night, Ezra laid a trap the way a rancher lays a trap for anything that's been stealing from him, quiet and patient. He mentioned, loud enough to carry, false plans, a supposed shipment of forged tools heading to Coldwater Gulch 2 days early, a route that didn't exist. 2 nights later, 3 of Vane's men were waiting on that false route in the dark, guns drawn, expecting an easy target. They found nothing, because there was nothing to find. But the trap had caught something anyway, because when Ezra rode straight back to the ranch and confronted Cyrus at first light, the younger man's face did all the confessing his mouth tried not to. "You told him," Ezra said. "Not a question." Cyrus's jaw tightened. "Man offered good money. Man like Vane, you don't exactly say no and expect things to stay easy for you. You could have said no to me instead." Could have. Cyrus's eyes flicked toward Freya, standing silent by the forge, arms crossed, her face carved from the same cold patience she'd worn on the auction block. "Didn't figure loyalty to a $5 bargain was worth losing my neck over." The words landed exactly as ugly as he meant them to. Freya didn't flinch. She had trained her face for worse than this a long time ago. "Get your things," Ezra said, voice gone iron hard. "Ride out. Now. And if I see you on this land again, I won't be near as patient the second time." Cyrus left within the hour, and neither of them watched him go past the first bend in the road, because there was nothing left in that direction worth watching. Cyrus's leaving didn't end the argument that had been quietly building between Freya and Ezra for weeks, the one neither of them had fully spoken aloud until a cold February evening finally forced it into the open. "We should file the claim formally," Freya said, standing at the forge, though the fire had long since banked low, her back to him. Her voice carrying the particular stubbornness he'd learned meant her mind was already made up. "Now, before he escalates further, not after." "Filing it makes it public," Ezra said. "Makes you a target in a way you're not fully a target yet. Vane's dangerous when he's uncertain. He'll be worse once the whole valley knows exactly what's at stake. He's already dangerous." She turned to face him, firelight low and orange across her tired features. "Fences cut. Salt in the trough. A spy in our own barn for 3 months. You think waiting makes any of that better?" "I think waiting keeps you alive," Ezra said, and something raw broke through his usual steadiness, something that had been building since the night he'd watched her stand alone in a town square and understood, for the first time, exactly how much this valley was capable of taking from a person it decided didn't belong to it. "I already lost one person I loved to something I couldn't stop, Freya. I'm not in a hurry to find out what losing a second one feels like." The words landed heavier than either of them expected, and for a long moment neither spoke, the admission sitting raw and unguarded between them in the cooling forge light. "I'm not Margaret," Freya said finally, gentler now. "I'm not going to fade from a fever you can't fight for me. Whatever comes for me, I intend to meet it standing, with my own 2 hands, the same way I've met everything else in this life." She crossed the small distance between them, took his scarred hand in both of hers. "Protecting me by keeping me small isn't protection, Ezra. It's just a softer kind of cage. I've lived in enough of those already." He looked at her a long moment, and something in his face, some old fear he'd carried since Margaret's last winter, finally visibly, began to loosen its grip. "All right," he said quietly. "We file. Together. Whatever it cost us." Together, Freya agreed. and something in the words, spoken now, for the second time in this hard, cold valley, felt less like a promise and more like a foundation. Iron laid true beneath everything they were building. They caught the next attempt in broad daylight, which told Freya, more than anything else could have, exactly how little patience Vane had left. Two riders, masked poorly, more interested in speed than concealment, came at the well housing near midday, buckets of something dark and foul already swinging from their saddles, clearly meaning to foul the water before anyone in the yard could stop them. Freya was faster. She crossed the yard at a dead run, closing the distance before either rider had fully dismounted, and caught the nearest man by the collar of his coat with one hand, hauling him bodily off his feet with a strength that made his companion's horse rear back in pure animal alarm. "Wrong well," she said, low and even, holding the struggling man a full foot off the ground without visible strain. "Wrong ranch. Wrong day. Let go of me, you—" Whatever ugly word he'd meant to finish that sentence with died somewhere in his throat when she tightened her grip, just slightly, just enough to make her point without needing to make it any harder than that. "Tell your employer," she said, "that the next man he sends out here to foul my well is going home with considerably more than a bruised pride to explain." She set him down, hard, and he scrambled back onto his horse fast enough to lose a stirrup twice trying, and both riders were gone back down the frozen track within a minute, buckets of foulness still swinging untouched and useless from their saddles. Ezra, watching from the barn doorway, axe still in hand from the chore he'd abandoned mid-swing, the moment he heard the commotion, crossed the yard slower, more measured, though something in his face carried the same fierce, protective pride Freya had started to recognize as entirely his own. "You didn't need me for that one either," he said. "No," Freya agreed, catching her breath, adrenaline still humming hot beneath her skin. "But I'm glad you came running anyway." He almost smiled at that. Almost. Wouldn't dream of doing otherwise. They didn't speak of it further that evening, but something had shifted in the valley's understanding of the Holloway Ranch after that. Word of the incident spreading faster even than the sabotage itself had. The blacksmith's daughter, who'd been sold for $5, had just thrown a grown man a full foot into the air with one hand and sent him running. Nobody in Ashford Creek laughed about the auction anymore. Not after that. The drought tightened its grip through February and into March, worse than any old-timer in the valley could remember. And the well, the same well Vane had been circling like a wolf around a dying fire, became the one thing standing between the ranch and true ruin. Freya kept the forge running anyway, stubborn, steady, turning out tools and blades for anyone in the valley, still willing to trade honest coin for honest steel, because work, she had learned a long time ago, was the one thing that kept grief and fear both at a manageable distance. It was on a hard, wind-scored afternoon in late March, checking the well housing for damage after another round of vandalism. Cracked boards, a fouled bucket, small cruelties meant to wear them down, rather than break them outright, that the real disaster came. A dead cottonwood, weakened at the root by months of dry ground, chose that exact moment to give way in a gust of wind, cracking loud as a gunshot, falling straight toward the well housing where Ezra knelt working. "Ezra!" Freya's voice tore across the yard before her mind had even fully processed the danger, and she moved the way she'd never quite let herself move in front of this valley before. Full speed, full strength, no caution left to spare for how she might look doing it. She didn't reach him in time to stop the fall entirely, but she reached him in time to throw herself between the worst of it and his kneeling body, catching the heaviest branch across her own shoulder and arm instead of his skull, absorbing an impact that would have crushed an ordinary-sized man clean through. The pain was immense. She barely registered it. Ezra was pinned beneath a smaller branch, his leg twisted wrong beneath him, blood already darkening through his trouser leg where a broken limb of the tree had torn skin. "Don't move," she said, voice steady despite the fire in her own shoulder. "Don't you dare move." She lifted the fallen tree off him with her bare hands, muscles screaming, and it took every ounce of strength her father's blood had given her to do it. Then she lifted Ezra himself, cradled against her chest like something precious, something she had no intention of losing, and carried him the full quarter-mile back to the cabin without once setting him down to rest. He was only half conscious by the time she got him inside, pale from blood loss, murmuring something she had to lean close to catch. "Should have seen it coming," he mumbled. "Tree's been dead for months. Should have cut it down myself." "Hush!" she said, already tearing clean cloth for bandages, her own injured shoulder, screaming with every movement and utterly ignored. You're not dying on me over a stubborn tree, Ezra Holloway. I didn't carry you a quarter mile just to lose the argument now. Something in that, even half-conscious, made the corner of his mouth twitch towards something almost like a smile. Wouldn't dream of losing an argument to you. Good, she said, voice cracking despite herself as she worked, because I don't intend to start losing them now. He slept through the worst of the fever that followed, 2 days of it, Freya never leaving his side, changing bandages, forcing broth between his lips, sitting in the low firelight with his hand held loosely in both of hers, larger than his by a considerable measure, and steadier in that moment than either of them had any right to expect. It was on the second night, deep past midnight, that he finally woke clear-eyed, fever-broken, and found her still sitting there, exhausted, her own shoulder wrapped tight beneath her shirt, refusing to have rested it properly, because resting meant leaving him alone. You should sleep, he said, voice rough. So should you, already did. 2 days of it, apparently, a ghost of a smile. You saved my life. You saved mine first, Freya said quietly. $5, a door you didn't have to open. Her thumb traced absently over his knuckles, the gesture unconscious, unpracticed, the most honest thing her hands had done in longer than she could remember. Seemed only fair to return the favor. Eventually, Ezra's fingers tightened around hers, weak but deliberate. Freya, don't, she said softly, though she didn't pull away. Don't say something you'll take back once the fever's fully gone. Wasn't the fever talking, he said. Been meaning to say it a while now. Just didn't know how, without it sounding like something owed instead of something meant. She looked at him a long moment, firelight moving soft across both their tired faces, and something in her chest, some old wall built brick by brick since the morning her father's forge went cold, finally quietly began to come down. Then say it, she whispered. However it comes out. He didn't get the chance, because that was the exact moment they heard the horses, many of them, riding hard, riding close, torchlight already flickering orange against the cabin's single frosted window. Freya was on her feet before the fear had even fully landed, already reaching for the iron poker beside the stove, already moving toward the door with the particular calm of a woman who had spent her whole life learning that fear, unlike work, had never once solved anything. Stay down, she told Ezra, voice gone hard and flat as forged steel. This one's mine to answer. Outside, the torches kept coming, and somewhere at the head of that riding column, unhurried as ever, sat a man in a fine coat who had finally decided that patience on its own was no longer going to be enough. Freya threw the cabin door open before the first rider had even fully reined in, and stood in the frame with the poker held loose and easy in one hand, the way her father had taught her to hold a hammer, ready, unhurried, utterly, without fear. She was willing to let this yard see. 6 riders, torches hanging. At the center of them, sitting his horse with the same unbothered calm he'd worn standing in this very yard weeks before.
The linguist.
Pleasant, even now, even with 6 armed men behind him. I'd hoped to speak with Mr. Holloway directly. Mr. Holloway's resting. Her voice didn't waver. You'll speak with me instead. Very well. Vane's eyes flicked past her toward the lit window, toward whatever he could see of the man lying injured inside. I understand there's been an accident. A tree, I'm told. Terrible luck out here this time of year. Terrible luck, Freya repeated, flat, or a fouled well housing that somebody's men fouled deliberately, weakening the ground a dead tree was already standing in. Something flickered behind Vane's pleasant eyes. Quick, almost impressed. You give me a great deal of credit. I give you exactly the credit you've earned. She stepped down off the porch, unhurried, and the torchlight caught her full height as she came, 7 feet of unwavering blacksmith's daughter, closing the distance between herself and 6 mounted men, without the slightest hesitation in her stride. Say what you came to say, Mr. Vane, then get off this land. The horses shifted, uneasy, the way animals get uneasy around something they can't quite categorize. One of the rider's hands drifted toward his belt, and Freya's eyes cut to him, cold and immediate, daring him with nothing more than a look to finish that motion. He didn't finish it. I, Vane said, voice gone quieter now, harder beneath the pleasantness, to offer one final, generous accommodation. The claim. The well. Signed over to me, quiet, before this drought gets worse and this valley starts asking harder questions about who's got water and who doesn't. His gaze swept the dark ranch behind her, You'll be compensated fairly. Mr. Holloway's medical care will be seen to. And this unpleasantness ends tonight, and if I refuse, then I imagine, Vane said, the unpleasantness continues. Fences, livestock, perhaps a fire nobody can quite trace back to its cause. Drought years are dangerous. For everyone, Miss Lindquist. Especially for a ranch that's already lost its well housing once this season. The threat landed exactly as ugly as he meant it to, and Freya felt something old and furious rise up through her chest. Not the cold patience she'd worn on the auction block. Something hotter than that. Something forged. You threatened a man's home, she said, voice gone low, dangerous in a way that made even the horses shift further back. You threatened his life and mine over a piece of paper and a hole in the ground. I've been threatened before, Mr. Vane, by men with more coin than you and less patience than these 6 riders you brought to hide behind tonight. She stopped, close enough now that Vane's own horse tossed its head, uneasy at her sudden nearness. My father died believing he'd protected me from men exactly like you. I intend to prove him right. Starting tonight, for one long moment, nothing moved. The torches guttered in the wind. Somewhere behind her, faint through the cabin door, she heard Ezra's voice, weak but rising, trying to call her name, trying to get himself upright despite his broken leg, and the sound of it steadied her more than any weapon in her hand could have. Vane studied her a long moment, and something behind his calculating eyes did. Finally, shift, not fear exactly. Freya doubted a man like that had much room left in him for fear, but something closer to recalculation. The look of a man realizing his numbers had been wrong from the start. You're a remarkable woman, Miss Lindquist, he said finally. Genuinely. It's rare I misjudge an asset this badly. I'm not an asset, Freya said. I never was. And you'll learn that the hard way if you ride up this track again. He gathered his reins, unhurried, the way he did everything. And for one final moment, his eyes swept the ranch behind her, the forge, the cabin, the well he still wanted so badly he'd risked riding out here in the dark to threaten a wounded man over it. This isn't finished, he said. Quiet, no pleasantness left in it at all. You've bought yourself a delay, not a victory. I'll take the delay, Freya said, and I'll be ready for whatever you bring next. The riders turned and rode back down the frozen track, torches shrinking to small orange points and then to nothing at all, swallowed by the dark. And Freya stood alone in that cold yard a long while, after the sound of hooves had faded completely, poker still gripped tight in one hand, shoulder throbbing where the fallen branch had struck her, heart hammering with an adrenaline that had nowhere left to go now that the danger had passed. Then slowly she let the poker fall to her side and turned back toward the cabin, toward the lit window, toward the man inside who had somehow managed to drag himself half upright against the doorframe despite his fever and his broken leg, watching her with an expression she had never once seen on any face turned toward her in her entire life. Not pity, not fear, not the careful, measuring look the whole world had given her since the day she'd grown too tall for it. Wonder, plain and open and entirely unguarded. You shouldn't be standing, she said, crossing the yard quickly now, catching him before his weakened leg could buckle beneath him. Couldn't exactly lie, there, Ezra said, voice rough, and listen to you face 6 armed men alone. I wasn't facing them alone, Freya said quietly, easing him back toward the bed, checking his bandages with hands that had only moments before been ready to swing a poker hard enough to crack a skull. I had you behind me the whole time, even half-conscious, even useless with that leg. A small, tired smile ghosted across her mouth. Turns out that was enough. He caught her hand before she could pull it back, held it there against his chest, and this time, neither of them let the moment slip past unfinished. I love you, he said, plain as anything, the same way he'd said everything true since the day he raised his hand in that crowded square. Been trying to find the right words for it since December. Guess a man doesn't always get to pick the moment. Sometimes the moment picks him. Freya's breath caught, and for once, standing over him in the low firelight with her own shoulder aching and her heart hammering harder than it had during the entire standoff outside, she let herself feel it fully, without the old instinct to brace against loss, creeping in to steal the joy of it. I love you too, she said, quiet, certain, the words costing her nothing at all, now that she'd finally let herself say them, which terrifies me considerably more than 6 armed men ever could. He laughed, weak and rough, and pulled her down carefully beside him, mindful of both their injuries, and for a long while neither of them spoke at all, Because there are silences that finally say everything. Two people have been too careful, too guarded, too afraid of losing each other to say out loud. Outside, the wind settled, and the forge sat cold and waiting behind the barn. And somewhere down the frozen track toward Ashford Creek, a man with a pleasant, ruined calculation rode home through the dark, already planning, with considerably less patience than before, exactly what he intended to bring against them next. Because Rutherford Vane did not lose gracefully. He had never once needed to learn how. And a woman who had just stood alone against 6 armed riders and sent them home empty-handed had, without fully realizing it yet, just made herself the single greatest obstacle standing between that man and everything he had ever wanted from this valley. The delay would not last through spring. Both of them understood that, even in that quiet, tender hour, even with the fear finally set down long enough to make room for something gentler. Because the true reckoning, the one Ambrose's old paper had set in motion the moment it came out from beneath that loose floorboard, was still waiting, patient as drought, somewhere just beyond the edge of this hard-won, fragile peace. It would not wait much longer. Ezra's leg mended slow through the last cold weeks of March, and by the time the first hard frost broke into something almost like the promise of spring, he could stand again without Freya's arm beneath his, though she stayed close anyway, out of habit now as much as necessity. They rode to the county seat together on the first clear day the roads allowed, and this time, Freya did not carry the old claim folded quiet against her heart, hidden, uncertain. She carried it in her hand, open ready, and laid it on the clerk's desk herself. "I'd like to formally reassert this claim," she said. "Anders Lindqvist's daughter. Direct descent. I have the papers to prove it, and I have witnesses in this valley willing to speak to my father's history here, if the county requires them." The clerk studied her a long moment, then looked past her, to Ezra standing steady at her side, and something in the way the two of them stood together, unhurried, unafraid, told him plainly enough that this was not a claim easily discouraged. "I'll need statements," he said. "Witnesses. It'll draw attention, filing something this size." "Let it," Freya said. He took the papers, he logged the claim. And somewhere down in Ashford Creek that same afternoon, word reached a locked office above the bank that the Lindqvist claim had gone from quiet rumor to official record, filed, witnessed, no longer a whisper Vane could simply outlast or outspend into silence. Rutherford Vane read the notice twice, standing at his window overlooking the frozen main street, and for the first time in longer than he cared to admit, something that might, in a lesser man, have been called worry moved behind his calculating eyes. Because a filed claim was no longer a matter he could settle quietly, one intimidated rider at a time. A filed claim meant lawyers, meant judges, meant a fight conducted in daylight, on paper where his usual weapons of shadow and pressure carried considerably less reach. He set the notice down and reached, after a long moment, for his own private ledger, and began with the patience of a man who had never once needed to hurry toward ruin, to plan an entirely different kind of attack. Because if the law itself was about to become the battlefield, then Rutherford Vane intended to make certain the law, like everything else in this valley, ultimately answered to him. Spring was coming to Ashford Creek, and with it, both Freya Lindqvist and the man determined to take everything she'd rebuilt understood, without needing to say it aloud, that the true reckoning was no longer waiting patiently in the wings. It had finally, unmistakably, arrived. Rutherford Vane did not sleep the night the claim notice reached him. He sat instead at his desk above the bank, lamp burning low, and worked through the small hours the way he worked through everything, patient, methodical, ruthless in the particular quiet way that had built him half a valley, one ruined family at a time, because a filed claim needed more than intimidation to defeat it now, needed paper of its own, needed a story the county would believe over a dead blacksmith's 30-year-old ink. By dawn he had one, a bill of sale, dated 1851, showing Anders Lindqvist selling his original claim outright to a land speculator long since dead, whose remaining interests, through a chain of transactions Vane had spent the night constructing with a forger's careful hand, had eventually passed to Vane himself, clean, legal, unimpeachable. Except it wasn't legal. It wasn't even close to true, which Vane knew perfectly well, signing his own false witness mark at the bottom of a document that existed for exactly one purpose: to make the truth expensive enough, complicated enough, exhausting enough, that a tired blacksmith's daughter and a wounded rancher would simply give up before a judge ever had to weigh real evidence against manufactured lies. He filed it the following week, quiet, unhurried, the way he did everything, and settled back to wait for the county to schedule its hearing. Patience, he reminded himself. Patience had built this entire valley beneath his feet, one ruined family at a time. It would not fail him now. Freya learned about the counterclaim from the same tired clerk who had first confirmed her father's original filing, and something cold and furious moved through her reading the forged date, the forged signature, a story about her father that was, in every particular, a lie. "My father never sold that claim," she said, voice flat. "Dangerous. He never would have. This land was the last thing he had left of the life he meant to build here, before he ever went back east for my mother and me. I believe you," the clerk said carefully. "But belief doesn't win a hearing, Miss Lindqvist. Evidence does. And right now, Mr. Vane's got a signed bill of sale, and you've got a claim filed 30 years after the fact by a man who's no longer alive to speak for it himself." "Then I'll speak for him," Freya said. "Whatever the hearing requires. I'll speak for him myself." The hearing was set for the third week of July, in the same dusty county courthouse where Freya had first laid her father's claim on that clerk's desk, and the weeks leading up to it passed in a blur of preparation that left neither Freya nor Ezra much room for sleep. Ambrose rode a wide circuit through 3 counties, gathering old miners, old neighbors, anyone still living, who had known Anders Lindqvist well enough to speak plainly about the man's character, his history, the impossibility of him ever quietly selling away the last piece of ground he'd claimed for his family in this country. Found 4 men willing to testify, he told them one evening, weary from the road but satisfied in a way that showed plainly through the exhaustion. Old miners, mostly. Men your father pulled out of collapsed shafts, same as he pulled me. Every one of them remembers him talking about this valley claim, right up until the day he left for the East Coast. Talked about it like a promise he meant to keep. "Will it be enough?" Ezra asked. Ambrose's face went careful. "Against a forged bill of sale with a real notary seal on it. However crooked that notary turned out to be paid to be might not be. Vane's not a fool. Whatever he's built it to survive exactly this kind of scrutiny." He looked at Freya. "You might need more than character witnesses, girl. You might need to catch the lie itself in the act of being a lie." Freya sat with that a long while after Ambrose had gone, staring at the forged documents, copied details laid out on the table before her, the date, the signature, the notary's seal, turning each piece over in her mind, the way she turned a piece of iron before deciding exactly where to strike it. Because a forgery, she knew, the same way she knew a flawed weld, the moment her hammer struck it, always carried a weakness somewhere, a place where the false metal didn't quite match the true. She simply had to find it before the hearing, or watch her father's name get buried a second time by a lie considerably crueler than the first debt that had ever been forced upon him. She found it 2 nights before the hearing, well past midnight, reading the copied document for perhaps the 40th time by lamplight, and when she did, something in her chest went very still, then very fierce. "Ezra." Her voice cut through the quiet cabin, urgent. "Ezra, wake up. I found it." He was beside her at the table within moments, hair still mussed from sleep, reading over her shoulder where her finger pressed against a single line near the bottom of the copied page. "The notary's seal," she said, "dated April 1851, filed in this very county." Her finger moved, tracing the date beside it. "Except this county wasn't organized until 1865, Ezra. There was no notary here to witness anything in 1851, because there was no county here at all yet. Just territory. Just unclaimed land, and a handful of scattered claims like my father's." Ezra stared at the date a long moment, understanding dawning slow and then all at once, the way morning breaks over a dark valley. "He backdated it," he said quietly. "Made a mistake doing it. Used the county's current seal on a document that's supposed to be 14 years older than the county itself. He got greedy," Freya said, and something fierce and satisfied moved beneath her exhaustion. "Or careless. Or both. Men like Vane always do, eventually. They build so many lies they stop checking each one carefully enough." Neither of them slept much the rest of that night. But for the first time since the forged bill of sale had first surfaced, both of them went into the coming hearing with something considerably sturdier than hope standing behind them. Freya barely slept at all the night before the hearing, lying awake long after Ezra's breathing had gone even bus at her, staring at the dark ceiling and letting her mind run in circles it couldn't quite climb out of. Because what if the judge didn't care about a mismatched date? What if Vane had more money hidden behind this than either of them had accounted for? More lawyers, more forged seals stacked deep enough to bury one small mistake beneath a dozen larger lies. What if she stood up in that courtroom tomorrow, and every eye in the valley watched her fail exactly the way half of them had once expected her to fail on an auction block? Only this time the stakes weren't $5. This time the stakes were everything, which was a foolish way to spend a night, she told herself. Except she couldn't quite stop doing it. Until Ezra's hand found hers in the dark, unasked, and she realized he hadn't been asleep at all either. "You're thinking too loud," he said, voice rough with the same exhaustion neither of them could shake. "Am I?" practically shouting. A pause, gentler now. "Whatever happens tomorrow, Freya, however the judge rules, you already proved something no forged paper can ever take back from you." "What's that you don't back down?" His fingers tightened around hers. "Not from an auction block. Not from 6 armed riders in the dark. Not from a man who spent 30 years learning exactly how to make people small enough to control." Certainty settled into his voice. "That's not nothing, whatever a courtroom decides tomorrow." Freya lay quiet a long moment, letting the words settle somewhere she could actually keep them. "I'm afraid," she admitted softly, the confession costing her more than she expected it to. "I don't say that often. Maybe I've never said it out loud at all, not since my father died." "I know," Ezra said. "Doesn't make you weak saying it. Makes you honest." His thumb traced slow, steady circles against the back of her hand. "I'm afraid too. Every single day since that tree came down. Doesn't stop me getting up each morning anyway." "Together then," Freya said. The fear still there but somehow lighter now. Shared instead of carried alone. "Together," he agreed. And eventually, sometime near dawn, exhaustion finally won out over worry. And they slept, hands still joined until the pale gray light of hearing day found them. The courthouse was packed the morning of the hearing. Packed tighter than Freya had ever seen a room in this valley. Ranchers and homesteaders and townsfolk who had, over the long months since a $5 auction bid, first scandalized this valley, slowly, quietly, changed their minds about exactly who Freya Lindqvist was. Vane sat at the front with his lawyer, composed, unbothered, dressed in the same fine coat he always wore, the coat that had never once, in Freya's experience, sunk properly into this valley's mud. He found her in the courthouse hallway before the proceedings began, unhurried as ever, his lawyer occupied elsewhere, and stepped close enough that only she could hear him. "Last chance," he said, quiet, pleasant, terrible. "Withdraw the claim this morning." Quietly. "I'll drop the countersuit, cover your legal costs, and today no further embarrassment for either of us." "Embarrassment," Freya repeated. "Flat. For you," Vane clarified. "Standing up in that room, watching a judge decide whether your father's memory is worth the paper it's written on. That can't be comfortable. I'm offering you a way to avoid it." "You're offering me a way to protect your forgery," Freya said. "Not my comfort." Something flickered behind his pleasant eyes. Quick, almost genuine. "You're certain of yourself, I'm certain of the truth," she said. "Which is more than you've got left standing behind you, Mr. Vane." He studied her a long moment, the calculation behind his eyes working through some final arithmetic, and then, finding no remaining angle worth pursuing, simply nodded once, turned, and walked back toward the courtroom without another word. Freya watched him go, hands steady now despite the sleepless night behind her, and understood with a certainty that settled deep and warm in her chest that whatever fear had kept her awake the night before had, sometime between that hallway and this moment, finally burned itself out completely. The judge, a tired, precise man named Hollis Pruitt, who had clearly seen every manner of land dispute this territory could produce, opened the proceedings without ceremony, and Vane's lawyer spoke first, laying out the bill of sale with practiced confidence, painting Freya's claim as a desperate, grief-fueled fiction dressed up as history. Then it was Freya's turn. She stood, 7 feet of quiet, unshaken presence, in a room that had once laughed her down to $5, and she did not raise her voice, because she had learned a long time ago that the truth rarely needed volume to carry. "My father," she said, "was not a man who sold promises cheaply. He crossed an ocean believing in this country's chance to let a man build something honest with his own 2 hands. He filed this claim before I was 10 years old, and he spoke of it to me, to his friends, to every man he ever pulled alive out of a collapsed mine shaft, right up until the morning he died, still believing he'd left me something worth having. She turned then, toward Vane's lawyer, toward the forged document laid out on the clerk's table between them. That bill of sale claims my father sold this land in April of 1851. Her voice, still even, still measured, carried a new hardness now, iron finding its edge. Except this county's own records, the very records Mr. Vane's lawyer just relied upon to establish his client's chain of title, show this county wasn't organized until 1865. There was no notary here in 1851 to witness any such sale. There was no seal to press into any such document. She looked directly at Vane for the first time since entering and did not look away. Because the document is a lie, Your Honor, a careless one, in the end, but a lie all the same. The courtroom had gone very quiet. Vane's composed expression, for the first time in Freya's experience of the man, cracked, just slightly, just enough for the room to see it happen. His lawyer rose quickly, attempting to recover ground. Miss Lindqvist, you're not a lawyer, not a clerk. What makes you qualified to identify an error in county records? I'm a blacksmith, Freya said. I check every weld twice before I trust it holds weight. Seemed only reasonable to check this document with the same care. A coincidence, then. A lucky guess. A date is a date, sir. Either the county existed in 1851, or it didn't. She held his gaze, unwavering. Which is it? He had no answer for that. He tried anyway. Perhaps a clerical error. An honest mistake in an otherwise legitimate document. Perhaps, Freya said. Except an honest document doesn't need a notary's seal borrowed from 2 years after the fact to hold itself together. Only a false one does. A murmur of agreement moved through the packed room, quiet but unmistakable, and the lawyer, sensing the ground shifting beneath him, retreated to his table without further questions. The judge examined the seal himself, comparing dates with the clerk's careful assistance, and the silence stretched long and taut while he did. Miss Lindqvist is correct, he said finally, voice flat with the particular disgust of a man who valued his courtroom's integrity above almost anything else. This document could not have been notarized as claimed, which raises considerably more serious questions than a simple property dispute. Vane's lawyer began to object, to explain, to construct some hurried alternative story, but the damage, already, was classified, and every person in that packed courthouse understood it plainly. It was Ambrose who delivered the final blow, called forward as a witness, not merely to Anders Lindqvist's character, but to something considerably more immediate. I've known Rutherford Vane's business dealings a long while, he said, standing straighter than his old joints usually allowed. Traded scrap and salvage across this whole territory for near 30 years. Man's built half his fortune the same way he built this forged bill of sale. Quiet pressure. Careful lies. Debts called in just cruel enough to break a family without quite breaking the law outright. Vane's lawyer stood quickly. Objection. This witness is speaking to reputation, not to the matter of this specific document. Overruled, the judge said, not looking up from the forged seal still spread across his desk. Given the nature of what we've just established, Counselor, I'm inclined to hear a great deal more about this man's reputation before this hearing concludes. Ambrose nodded, once, grateful, and continued. 6 armed riders came to the Holloway Ranch this past March, he said. Threatened a wounded man in his own home. Threatened Miss Lindqvist herself, standing alone in that yard against every one of them. He looked toward the back of the room, where 2 ranchers Freya recognized from the long winter's quiet solidarity, sat waiting, exactly as arranged. There's men in this room who can name the riders, if the county cares to ask. I care to ask, the judge said, and his voice had gone hard now, official. The voice of a man no longer weighing a simple boundary dispute, but something considerably darker underneath it. Sheriff, I believe you'll want to hear what these gentlemen have to say before this session adjourns. One by one, the ranchers rose, and one by one, they confirmed names, dates, the particular cruelty of a man who had spent 30 years learning exactly how far he could press a valley before the valley learned to press back. A murmur ran through the courthouse, and Freya watched, with a fierce, quiet satisfaction, as the very ranchers who had once laughed at her on the auction block stood, unprompted, to confirm exactly what Ambrose had just described, having heard the story from neighbors, having pieced together, over the long months, Exactly what kind of man had been operating quietly in their valley all along. The sheriff, seated near the back of the room, rose without being asked twice. Rutherford Vane was arrested before the courthouse doors opened again that afternoon, charged with forgery, fraud, and conspiracy to intimidate. The pleasant, calculating composure he had worn through every dealing in this valley's finally completely gone. He said nothing as the sheriff led him out through the packed courtroom, past ranchers who had once feared his name too much to meet his eyes. Now, every one of them watched him go without a flicker of that old fear left in their faces. Freya watched him go too, and found, standing there in that crowded room with her father's vindicated name finally spoken plainly into the county's own record, that she felt no triumph in his ruin. Only relief. Only the quiet, exhausted piece of a debt finally fully paid. "It's over," Ezra said quietly beside her, his hand finding hers without either of them quite deciding to reach for the other first. "It's over," Freya agreed, and let herself, for the first time in nearly a year, believe it completely. His trial, when it came that autumn, lasted 3 short days. The forged seal alone was damning enough, but the testimony that followed, writers naming themselves and each other, a notary admitting under oath to selling his own seal for a sum he'd since spent twice over, painted a picture too complete for any jury to doubt. He was sentenced to 8 years, his remaining holdings across the valley, seized and auctioned to settle his debts, timber contracts, and mining claims scattered piece by piece to men who had once feared to bid against him, and now, with something like grim satisfaction, bid freely. Freya did not attend the sentencing. She had by then already spent enough of her life standing in rooms built around another person's judgment of her worth. She had no wish to spend one more afternoon watching a courtroom decide the worth of someone else. The judge confirmed the Lindquist claim in full. Within the week, the ranch's true boundary settled at last: the well, the forge, the whole quiet stretch of valley they had built their fragile new life upon, legally, permanently theirs. And that same week, as though the valley itself had simply been waiting for the lie to be cleared away before it could breathe freely again, the drought finally broke. Rain came first as a hesitant gray drizzle, then as a full drumming downpour that lasted 2 full days, soaking into ground that had gone hard and cracked, and desperate through nearly a year of dry heat. Freya stood in the yard the first evening of it, face turned up to the sky, letting it soak clean through her shirt, laughing, actually laughing, a sound Ezra realized he had never once heard from her before that moment, and found he wanted to hear again for the rest of his life. The months that followed passed the way healing months do, quietly, steadily, one honest day building upon the last. The forge, once a ruined, forgotten corner of a struggling ranch, became something considerably more by the time autumn's first cool mornings arrived. Word of Freya's work, and of her father's name finally cleared and honored, had spread the length of the valley, and ranchers came now not out of cautious solidarity, but out of plain, simple respect for good steel made by capable hands. She hired help of her own, eventually, 2 young men glad of honest work, and taught them the trade the same patient way her father had once taught her: hammer and heat, and the particular discipline of never rushing a piece of iron toward a shape it wasn't ready to hold. One evening in late August, a young widow named Clara Fenn arrived at the forge with a broken plow, and 3 small debts stacked up against a harvest that hadn't come in strong enough to cover them. Freya fixed the plow for half price without being asked to, and said nothing about it when Clara tried to argue. "Somebody did the same for me once," Freya said simply. "Different currency, same kindness. Pass it along when you're able, and we'll call the account settled." Clara left with tears she didn't quite manage to hide, and, word of the gesture, quiet as it was meant to be, spread through the valley the way all good things eventually spread in a place small enough to notice them. Ezra's leg healed clean, though it ached still, some cold mornings, in a way that reminded him, not unkindly, of exactly how close he had come to losing considerably more than a ranch that hard, terrible spring. They spoke of Vane rarely. After the trial that followed his arrest sent him away to serve a long sentence for his forgery and his threats, both of them content to let that chapter close quietly, rather than dwell on it. The valley, for its part, seemed content to forget him just as thoroughly, the way a healed wound eventually forgets the shape of the wound that made it. It was late September, the cottonwoods along the creek gone gold and rattling in the first cool evening winds, When Ezra asked Freya to walk with him up to the old pine that stood alone on the rise above the ranch house, the one with a view clean across the whole valley, the well, the forge, the mended fences, everything they had built and defended and finally kept. He didn't say much on the walk up. She didn't push him to. At the top, with the whole valley spread gold and quiet beneath the evening sky, he turned to face her and reached into his coat, drew out something small, a ring he'd made. She realized with a soft, sudden ache, not by any jeweler in town, but forged by his own hand, in her own forge. Late some night when she'd been too deep in her own work to notice him slip away with a scrap of good steel. "It's not fancy," he said, and for the first time since she'd known him, his usually steady voice carried a tremor he didn't bother hiding. "Didn't figure fancy was what you'd want anyway. Figured you'd want something that was made honest. Made to hold." Freya looked at the ring. Plain iron, simple, strong, shaped by hands that had learned, over the long, hard months of that year, exactly how to work beside hers instead of over them. "Ezra Holloway," she said, and her own voice wasn't steady either. Not anymore. Not standing here with the whole valley laid gold and rescued beneath them. "Are you asking me to marry you?" "I am." No hesitation in it now. Whatever tremor had been in his voice a moment before gone, replaced by the same plain certainty he'd carried into that crowded square nearly a year before. Not because the debt's cleared, or the claims settled, or any obligation either one of us ever owed the other. Just because I want you here. Every morning. Every hard winter and every gold autumn evening after this one, for as long as either of us gets to keep having them. Freya closed her hand around the ring, around his hand still holding it, and felt something settle into place inside her chest that had been unmoored since the morning her father died, something that felt, finally, completely like home. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Ezra. 1,000 times yes." He slid the plain iron ring onto her finger, and it fit. Of course it fit, because he had measured it carefully, secretly, against a glove she hadn't even noticed missing for 2 full days back in August. And Freya laughed again, that same rare, unguarded sound, and pulled him into an embrace that lifted his feet clean off the ground. They married 3 weeks later, a small ceremony in the yard beneath that same old pine, attended by nearly every family in the valley, who had once, in a colder season, looked at Freya Lindqvist and seen only her size, only her strangeness, only a bargain struck cheap on a humiliating auction block. The morning of the wedding, Freya stood before a small mirror propped against the cabin wall, wearing a dress she had herself over 3 quiet evenings. Dark green wool, simple, unadorned, cut to fit a body she had spent her whole life apologizing for and had finally, somewhere in the long, hard months of that year, stopped apologizing for completely. "You look," Ezra said, catching sight of her in the doorway, and then simply stopped, words failing him entirely for the first time since she'd known him. "That bad," Freya teased, though her own voice had gone soft and uncertain in a way it rarely did anymore. "That impossible," he said finally. "I keep waiting to wake up from this winter. Keep thinking a man doesn't get to be this fortunate without paying for it somewhere down the line." "You already paid for it," Freya said quietly, crossing to him, taking his hands in hers. $5, and a hand that never once came down when it counted. "I'd say the accounts are settled, Ezra Holloway." "More than settled." Ambrose gave her away, weathered and proud, tears he didn't bother hiding running freely down a face that had known her father's kindness firsthand, and had, in the end, helped make certain that kindness finally found its way home. The vows they spoke beneath that old pine were plain, unpolished, exactly the kind of promise 2 people forge when they've already survived worse than any hardship a wedding day could throw at them. "I don't have poetry in me," Ezra admitted, standing before the small gathered crowd, Freya's hands steady in his. "Never have. What I've got is this. I raised my hand once because something in me knew, before the rest of me caught up to it, that you were worth more than this valley was willing to pay. I intend to keep proving that, every day, for as long as you'll let me. I spent a long time believing my size made me too much for this world to want," Freya said, her voice carrying clear and steady across the quiet yard. "You never once made me feel like too much. You made me feel like exactly enough. I intend to spend the rest of my life making sure you know what that gift meant to me." Mrs. Dillard, of all people, brought a pie to the small gathering afterward and said nothing more about bargains at all. Winter came again that year, gentler than the last, And Freya and Ezra spent it the way they had spent every season since that first frozen wagon ride from the auction block. Together, steady, building something neither drought, nor greed, nor forged lies had managed to take from them. On quiet evenings, when the forge fire burned low and the wind moved soft through the pines, outside, Freya sometimes found herself turning her wedding ring, plain iron, forged by his own hand, and thinking back to a crowded square nearly 2 years gone now, to an auctioneer's voice dropping lower and lower, to a room full of laughter that had, for one terrible, endless moment, made her feel smaller than she had ever felt in her entire life. And then to a hand, raised steady above that laughing crowd, holding 2 coins that were, in truth, worth considerably less than the man who held them. He had never lowered that hand. Not that day, when the gavel finally fell. Not once, in all the hard months and harder trials that followed. Not now, sitting beside her in the low firelight of a home they had built and defended and finally completely made their own. "What are you thinking?" Ezra asked, catching her turning the ring again, watching her face in the gentle orange light. Freya looked up at him, at the man who had raised his hand when no one else in that whole cruel town had dared to, and reached across the small distance between them to take his hand in hers, the way she had taken it that very first night, and every night since, and every night she now understood. Still to come. "I'm thinking," she said softly, "that you raised your hand when no one else would, and you never once put it down." Ezra's fingers closed around hers, steady, certain, forever. "Never intended to," he said. "Not for you." Outside, the winter wind moved gentle through the valley, past a well that no longer needed defending, past a forge that had become the beating heart of an entire community, past fences mended, and land finally rightfully theirs. And inside that small, warm cabin, 2 people who had each once believed themselves too broken, too burdened, too unlikely for a love this steady, sat together in the firelight, hands joined, hearts finally fully at rest. The gavel had fallen on a $5 bid nearly 2 years before, but some purchases, Freya had come to understand, were never really about the price at all. They were about the hand that reached out first, and simply, stubbornly, refused to ever let go.